This whole DEI thing, it feels like it's everywhere you turn these days.
Yeah, it's definitely having a moment.
And from the looks of all the research and articles you sent over, it seems like people are really fired up about it too. We got perspectives all over the map.
Oh, absolutely. It's become such a hot button issue.
Mm-hmm.
It really gets at some of those really fundamental questions we're grappling with as a society, about fairness and opportunity and like what we really value.
Totally. So for this deep dive, let's try to kind of cut through all that noise and really figure out, what DEI actually means, and even more importantly, why it's become such a lightning rod issue.
Right.
Now, a lot of these sources, they kick things off by defining, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Could you maybe walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting how many of the sources agree on those core definitions, even if they have totally different opinions on DEI as a whole.
Right.
So generally, they define diversity as the presence of a wide range of identities and perspectives. So think, race, gender, age, socioeconomic background, all that.
Okay, so diversity is about recognizing and valuing all those differences. What about equity? How's it different from just having a diverse group of people?
Well, equity goes a step further. It recognizes that just having a diverse representation isn't actually enough. You have to address those systemic barriers and create paths for equal outcomes because some groups have historically been disadvantaged. So equity is really about leveling the playing field.
Makes sense. So it's not just about having everyone at the table. It's about making sure everyone has a fair shot to succeed.
Right.
Okay, and then we've got inclusion. How does that piece fit in?
Inclusion is all about creating an environment where everyone feels respected, empowered, and like they can fully participate. So it's that sense of belonging, knowing that your voice is going to be heard and your perspective matters. You can kind of think of it as the glue that holds diversity and equity together.
Okay, so we've got our definitions squared away. Now, a bunch of the articles you sent mentioned that there was a big jump in DEI conversations after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. It feels like that event really shifted things in a major way.
Yeah, for sure. That event really sparked a global reckoning with racial injustice. It forced individuals, organizations, even governments to really confront those systemic inequities. We saw the surge in DEI initiatives across tons of different sectors as people grappled with how to create a more just and equitable society.
But as you might expect, there was also some pushback. One of the things that really stuck out to me was the Trump administration's decision to roll back those DEI programs in the federal government.
Right. The Trump administration framed those actions as a way to ensure a colorblind and merit-based society. They argued that some DEI programs were discriminatory and didn't actually prioritize skills and qualifications.
And there were even a couple of quotes he sent over where Trump specifically said that there are only two genders,
Yeah.
male and female. We talk about a different perspective.
Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty stark. So you had this huge push for DEI after George Floyd, and then this almost immediate counter-movement for the Trump administration. Talk about a pendulum swing.
Yeah, it really highlights how polarized this whole issue has become. And it's not just about politics either. This debate is happening in boardrooms, classrooms, even online forums.
Right. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
It's interesting, though, because you also included some data from the Office of Personnel Management that showed that the federal workforce's demographics barely changed between 2017 and 2021. So despite all this back and forth, the needle hardly moved.
It is surprising, right? You'd think with such different approaches, you'd see a bigger change. It makes you wonder how effective those top-down initiatives really are and whether there are some deeper, more systemic factors at play.
Okay, so we've got the political side of things, but you also included an article about Elon Musk criticizing Mayor Bass's response to those wildfires. He called her a DEI hire. Is that a new way to criticize someone? It feels pretty loaded.
It definitely is. And that term, DEI hire, is being used to question the qualifications and competence of certain individuals, especially women and minorities. And it feeds into this narrative that people are getting hired based on their identity instead of merit, which is a big criticism of those DEI initiatives.
So it's almost like a quick way to dismiss someone's achievements by implying that they were only hired to meet some kind of diversity quota.
Exactly. And that type of rhetoric can be really damaging, especially for people who are already facing systemic barriers.
And it's not just in politics either. You also sent over some information on companies like Walmart and McDonald's. They've been scaling back their DEI initiatives. It feels like there might be a connection there to that Supreme Court decision against affirmative action in college admissions.
You're right. There does seem to be a link. That legal development has really emboldened critics of DEI, and it's given companies a legal basis to kind of reverse course. It's created this climate where companies might be more hesitant to implement or even maintain those strong DEI programs.
So we've got this really complicated interplay between political agendas, social movements, legal decisions, and corporate responses. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And to really understand why DEI has become such a flashpoint, we need to dig deeper into those arguments for and against it.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that whole DEI hire label?
But what's interesting is that it really reflects this deeper anxiety we have as a society about fairness and meritocracy. On one hand, you have folks who believe that those historical injustices need to be actively addressed, even if it means giving certain groups an advantage.
And then on the other side, you have folks who believe that any focus on identity is inherently unfair and that it undermines a system that should be based on merit.
Exactly. And navigating that tension is really at the heart of this whole DEI debate.
Well, based on the mountain of information you sent my way, we got a lot more to explore. Maybe we can dive into some of those specific arguments next.
I think that's a great place to start. It's time to unpack the evidence and see what the research actually tells us about the effectiveness of DEI. Let's dig into some of those arguments then. One of the most common criticisms of DEI is that it can lead to reverse discrimination.
Oh, so the idea that, by focusing on diversity, you might actually end up harming people who aren't part of a specific group.
Right, exactly.
Making you feel like the system's working against them.
Exactly. Critics argue that if you put too much emphasis on certain identities, you risk overlooking qualified individuals simply because they don't help you meet a diversity quota.
So it kind of brings us back to that whole merit-based argument we talked about with the Trump administration. This belief that hiring and promotions should be based just on skills and experience. But doesn't that kind of ignore the historical context? The fact that some groups have been systematically disadvantaged for centuries?
Yeah, that's a key counterpoint that DEI advocates make. They argue that a true meritocracy can only exist if everyone has an equal starting point. So DEI initiatives, they say, they aim to address those historical imbalances, to level the playing field so that merit can actually shine through.
So it's less about lowering the bar and more about removing the hurdles that have prevented some folks from even getting to the starting line?
Precisely. But this kind of leads to another layer of the debate. Some critics say that DEI programs can actually be divisive.
Oh, really?
That by focusing on our differences instead of what unites us, it can create resentment and tension.
Interesting. So instead of bringing people together, it might actually push them further apart.
Yeah.
Create like an us versus them mentality.
That's the worry. But on the flip side, DEI proponents argue that true unity can only happen when we acknowledge and address those systems of oppression that have historically marginalized certain groups. They say it's not about ignoring our differences, but rather using them as a starting point to build bridges and create a more inclusive society.
So it's kind of a question of whether focusing on those differences ultimately divides us or helps us build a stronger, more understanding community.
Exactly. And it's important to note that the research on DEI's effectiveness is still kind of developing. There's no real consensus yet on whether these initiatives actually lead to the outcomes people are hoping for. Some studies show positive impacts on things like innovation and employee morale, while others haven't found much of an effect at all.
It makes you wonder if maybe it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah.
Maybe how effective DEI is really depends on how it's implemented in the context of the organization. A whole bunch of factors.
Absolutely.
Speaking of effectiveness, what about that argument that DEI programs are just a waste of time and resources?
Right.
Like all talk and no action.
Yeah, that's another common criticism. And it often comes down to a lack of transparency and accountability around those DEI efforts. Some organizations might implement programs that are pretty superficial without really addressing those underlying systemic issues, like unconscious bias in hiring or promotion practices.
So it's not enough to just check boxes and say we're doing DEI.
Right.
It's a real commitment to actually changing policies, practices, and that deep-rooted organizational culture.
For sure.
Okay, but let's flip this for a second. What happens if we just ignore all of these issues altogether? Like if we pretend everything's fine and dandy?
Well, there's a lot of research now that suggests diverse and inclusive organizations tend to be more innovative, more creative, even financially successful.
Oh, interesting. So embracing DEI isn't just about doing the right thing ethically. It could actually be good for business, too.
It can. A company with a diverse workforce is more likely to understand and cater to a diverse customer base. And teams with people who have different perspectives are often better at problem solving and coming up with new ideas.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
But it's not just about the bottom line, right? There's some broader societal implications to consider as well.
absolutely. A lack of diversity and inclusion can lead to social unrest, political polarization, and even a diminished sense of belonging for a lot of people. It can create a society where certain voices are just systematically shut out of the conversation.
So this isn't just some abstract debate. It's got real-world consequences for everyone.
Hmm.
But it feels like we're kind of stuck in this loop of opposing viewpoints and political maneuvering. How do we even start to move forward?
You're right. It's definitely a challenging landscape to navigate, but I think recognizing the complexity of the issue is a really important first step. There are valid concerns on both sides, and we need to move beyond those simple solutions and sound bites.
Yeah, instead of getting caught up in all the rhetoric, we need to focus on having those nuanced, evidence-based conversations about how to actually create a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. We have to be willing to listen to different perspectives, challenge our own assumptions, and work together to find solutions that actually benefit everyone. It's about understanding how interconnected our experiences really are and recognizing that we all have a stake in creating a more inclusive world.
You know, one thing that really struck me when I was going through all these materials is how much the whole conversation around DEI seems to be driven by emotion. You know, passion, frustration, even fear. It's all there.
It's true. DEI touches on some really personal issues like identity, belonging, fairness, and those are things that people feel very strongly about. But sometimes those strong emotions can make it hard to have productive conversations.
Yeah, it's like everyone's coming to the table with their own lived experiences and beliefs. And it's tough to bridge that gap. So how do we move past all that emotional charge and actually get to a place where we can have those good, productive dialogues?
I think it starts with empathy. Trying to really understand where the other person is coming from, even if you don't agree with their perspective. It's about recognizing that everyone has a story, and those stories shape how they see the world.
So instead of just writing someone off as wrong or offensive, we should try to understand the experiences that led them to their viewpoint.
Exactly. And it's also about being open to having your own perspective challenged, to being open to the possibility that you might not have all the answers, and that there might be other ways of looking at things.
It's about recognizing that learning and growth often come from those uncomfortable moments, from being willing to sit with those challenging ideas and really wrestle with them.
You know, one of the things that I find really fascinating about this whole DEI discussion is how it's making us re-examine our ideas about meritocracy.
Yeah, like what does merit even mean in a society that hasn't always been fair?
Exactly. We're being asked to consider whether a system that claims to be based on merit can really be fair if the playing field isn't level. It's making us confront that uncomfortable truth that privilege and opportunity are often distributed unevenly.
And question whether our own successes are really just the result of our hard work and talent, or if we've benefited from systems that advantage some groups over others.
It's a really challenging conversation to have, but I think it's crucial if we want to build a society that's more just and equitable.
Okay, so we've covered the political landscape, the arguments for and against DEI, the emotional side of things, and even the definition of merit. Is there anything else we need to think about before we wrap up this deep dive?
You know, one thing that I think often gets lost in this whole debate is the human element.
What do you mean?
Well, we tend to talk about DEI in these abstract terms, policies, statistics, quotas. But at its core, DEI is about people. It's about building a world where everyone feels valued, respected, and like they belong.
It's about recognizing that every single person has inherent dignity and worth, regardless of their background or identity.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we all need to remember as we navigate these really complex conversations. It's not just about winning arguments or proving points. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to you, the listener. As you've been listening to this conversation, what's been standing out to you?
What are some thoughts or questions that have come up?
This deep dive has been about looking at all the different sides of DEI. But ultimately, it's about you and how you choose to engage with these issues.
Because the future of DEI isn't going to be decided by politicians or corporations.
It's something that we're all going to shape together through our actions, our conversations, and our choices.
So we'll leave you with this. How will you contribute to building a more just and equitable world?
As we've been going through all these different aspects of DEI, it's become pretty clear that there's no easy answer. There's no magic wand we can wave to create a perfectly inclusive world.
Right. There's no one solution that's going to fit every situation. What works for one organization or community might not work for another. And how we get to a more equitable society, it's going to be different for everyone.
It's like that saying, the map is not the territory. We can have all these theories about DEI, but the real work happens out there in the real world, in our daily interactions and decisions.
Totally. And that's why it's so important to go beyond just the ideas and think about what DEI means in practice. What actual steps can we take both individually and collectively to make people feel like they belong and create opportunities for everyone?
Well, I think it starts with being intentional. You can't just sit back and hope that diversity and inclusion will just happen. We have to actually work at it in our workplaces, our communities, even our personal lives.
And that can look like a lot of different things. It could mean taking a look at hiring practices and making sure there's no unconscious bias, setting up mentorship programs for groups that are underrepresented, or even just being more aware of how we talk to and interact with each other.
It's also about making sure that people feel safe to speak their minds, share their perspectives, and challenge the way things are without worrying about being judged or punished.
Absolutely. Psychological safety is huge. If people don't feel comfortable sharing their opinions and concerns, then we're missing out on valuable insights and chances to grow. And that goes for everyone, not just people who have been traditionally marginalized.
One thing that's been on my mind as we've been talking is the role of education. It seems like a lot of the pushback against DEI comes from people not really understanding it or even believing misinformation about what it is.
I think you're right. Education is really key. It's about helping people understand the history of inequality, the systemic barriers that are still in place, and how creating a more inclusive society benefits everyone.
And it's not just about formal education either. It's also about having those tough conversations with friends and family, challenging stereotypes and biases when we see them.
It's about being open to learning and growing, even if it means admitting we were wrong before.
And we also have to remember that this isn't a one-time thing. There's no finish line where we can say, okay, we've achieved perfect diversity and inclusion. We're done.
Exactly. It's a constant process of learning, adapting, and trying to be better. And it's something we all need to be a part of, holding each other accountable.
Because in the end, this isn't just about numbers or checking boxes. It's about creating a world where everyone feels valued, respected, and like they can achieve their full potential.
It's about understanding that our differences are what make us strong. And when we embrace those differences, we create something truly amazing.
And that's something worth striving for, don't you think?
Absolutely. And as you go back to your lives with these new ideas and perspectives, we want you to think about what role you can play in the future of DEI.
What can you do? What conversations can you start?
How can you be an ally, an advocate, a champion for a world that's more just and equitable?
Creating a more inclusive society starts with each of us. And as we've seen in this deep dive, it's a journey that requires empathy, understanding, and the courage to challenge our own assumptions.
Thanks for joining us as we explored DEI. We hope this got you thinking and maybe even inspired you to take action in your own life.
Because together we can build a world where diversity isn't just accepted, but celebrated, where equity is a reality and inclusion is the foundation of our society.
That's the future we're working towards. How about you?